Really excited to be here with Professor Wayne Visser at the Cambridge University, where he's a fellow, and we're going to be talking about your poem, I Am an African. And you could start by telling us a little bit about your family and why you're an African, or how you started off being an African.
Well, I was born in Zimbabwe, in Bulawayo, grew up there and in South Africa, and spent most of my life there, based in the UK now. My parents and my grandparents came out to Africa after the Second World War, a time that was very difficult in Europe, came to find new opportunities. My father's family from the Netherlands, my mother's family from the UK. And they came first to South Africa, then to Zimbabwe. My mum actually spent time as a baby in the Congo as well. So they really grew up in Africa as well, and considered themselves also African.
Yeah. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about your childhood growing up there. What are your memories of Zimbabwe and South Africa?
Well, of course, I love the country, both countries really. But I grew up in a time when it was still racially divided, at a time when the war for independence was happening in Zimbabwe, and then in South Africa, all the way through to the birth of democracy, you know, through to the 1994 elections. And for me, I suppose, besides the sort of idyllic upbringing of being close to nature and all of those things that I love, you know, for me it was a gradual awakening to the discrimination that was going on. I mean, I went in South Africa and in Zimbabwe to a whites-only school. And it was only when I got to university that we were mixed, and that I started to have also the challenge to my worldview. And it was actually an economics professor who really opened my eyes and made me realize, you know, this is a shocking and a completely unfair and diabolical system of which we're part of. And fortunately, that was the time when it was just starting to break down, and all the changes came with Mandela and so on. And so, strangely enough, you know, I'm living proof that also people can change, their attitudes can change, their worldview can change, and more than that, you know, the rest of my life and my career has been spent trying to be a champion for all of those good things around social justice and also the environmental piece.
So at the Who is an African series at the Aspen Institute, we really try to think about the non-traditional faces of Africa. So there's some people who, a few generations ago, you would say that's not an African. But of course now, any person on earth, when you ask them, where are you from? It's usually, you know, do you have time, right? So everybody has very complex backgrounds now. And I've heard you in some of your writings say that in a way you feel that as growing up the way you did, that in a way you were complicit with the system. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that, or what you meant by that.
Well, of course, I was, you know, I grew up with white privilege in Africa. And so even though I didn't have the awareness as a young child, I think to know how wrong it was, and I wasn't an activist fighting against it in those times. So therefore I was complicit because, you know, I was benefiting from the system. And it only was when I, you know, had the awakening to the system I was part of that I could be one of the ones who opposed that system and helped to try to make the change happen. And I think that's true of so many things, you know, in society. We, by benefiting from a system, we are complicit in it. And so I sometimes say that, you know, today we're still in a system of global apartheid. If you look at inequality in the world, you know, inequality has been going up, and there are many of us who benefit from that. And so unless we're speaking up against it, doing what we can in our own sphere of influence, you know, we are complicit in that.
Okay, so it's important to be breaking down the system that you feel is harmful. I have a really quick thought around this. One of the things we say in the program is that you cannot really blame somebody for generational wrongs or for things that their grandparents did, or shame anybody for their background, because you were born who you were, and at that time you were a child. What do you say to that as a challenge to this idea of complicity?
I mean, I think we should all have the capacity to acknowledge the past and to acknowledge if that is in our kind of ancestry, that there was abuse, exploitation that went on, that we should be able to apologize for that on behalf of those ancestors of ours. And it's a way of acknowledging how wrong it was. It's not necessarily saying that, I personally did this or that I support it in any way. In fact, it's the opposite. It's a way of saying, I completely distance myself from the abuse that happened in the past or the injustices that happened in the past. And so I am in favor of apologizing, but at the same time, I think we all, we're born where we were born, we grew up in the context we grew up, and it's more important what we're doing with that now and how we're living our life now and the causes that we're fighting for now.
No, that's right, that's right. I think we also want to say, if you sound like you would be many generations down as an African by now if you had stayed on the continent. What were the circumstances of your leaving Africa, and how do you stay connected now and continue to contribute to the different things that are happening there?
Yeah, I mean, mainly I came to study abroad, so at Edinburgh in the UK, and then later at Nottingham, so doing my master's and my PhD. And largely, I think the two reasons I stayed, one is, my career started to take on an international dimension, and there's simply the logistics of being, close to Europe and close to, being able to travel more easily from a base in the UK. The other is just as far as family goes. I met my wife who's Kosovan, but living in the UK, and then her kids are here, and so our kids are here. And so in the end it becomes about where is family. But I try to get back as often as I can. I've for many years done teaching at the Gordon Institute for Business Science in South Africa. I run workshops in Nigeria, in Kenya, in fact, and many places. So whenever I have the opportunity to get back and learn from what's going on in Africa, and then share, of course, any experience I might have, I take that opportunity.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time. Professor Wayne Visser at Cambridge University Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. I am an African, not because I was born there, but because my heart beats with Africa's. I am an African not because my skin is black, but because my mind is engaged by Africa. I am an African not because I live on its soil, but because my soul is at home in Africa. When Africa weeps for her children, my cheeks are stained with tears. When Africa honors her elders, my head is bowed in respect. When Africa mourns her victims, my hands are joined in prayer. And when Africa celebrates her triumphs, my feet are alive with dancing. I am an African, for her blue skies take my breath away, and my hope for the future is bright. I am an African, for her people greet me as family and teach me the meaning of community. I am an African, for her wildness quenches my spirit and brings me closer to the source of life. And when the music of Africa beats in the wind, my blood pulses to its rhythm, and I become the essence of sound. When the colors of Africa dazzle in the sun, my senses drink in its rainbow, and I become the palette of nature. When the stories of Africa echo round the fire, my feet walk in its pathways, and I become the footprints of history. I am an African, because she is the cradle of our birth and nurtures an ancient wisdom. I am an African, for she lives in the world's shadow and bursts with a radiant luminosity. I am an African, because she is the land of tomorrow, and I recognize her gifts as sacred.